High in the frozen Alps, where snowstorms roar like beasts and the cold slices through bone, a team of researchers moved slowly across a field of ancient glacial ice. They weren't treasure hunters, and they weren't searching for fame. This was routine climate data collection, drilling cores, measuring oxygen levels, gathering pollen samples locked in the ice for millennia. But no one was prepared for what they would find that day. One of the graduate students, just 24 years old, spotted it first. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a twisted log, half buried in bluish snow. But the shape was too smooth, too symmetrical. A curve, like a ribcage. Fingers, curled as if reaching for something that never came. They'd found a body, not a fossil, not bones, a whole, preserved human body. And it wasn't alone. Within a 30-meter radius, the team uncovered not one, but 12 individuals, frozen in positions that felt eerily human. One lay with their arms wrapped around another, a child pressed to the chest of an adult, perhaps a mother. Another figure sat against a stone, legs folded beneath them, head bowed as if in prayer or resignation. But these weren't victims of a modern avalanche. There were no signs of modern gear, no nylon or synthetic clothing. Instead, what they found was something far older, much, much older. Woven plant fibers, leather bindings, wooden spears tipped with stone blades, not iron, not bronze. And most telling of all, no signs of written language, no metal, no pottery, the kind of simplicity that whispers of prehistory. And here's the part that truly sent shockwaves through the scientific world. The ice surrounding these bodies was dated to at least 10,000 years ago. That puts the discovery near the tail of the last ice age, before the first Egyptian pyramids, before Stonehenge, before agriculture took root across most of the world. This wasn't just a group of ancient people who got caught in a blizzard. This was something else, a tribe, a community, that had somehow made it up into the mountains and then never came back down. But why? And who were they? The press called them the lost tribe of the ice. The scientific community, they didn't know what to call them, because nothing like this had ever been found. As news spread, teams of specialists were flown in from all over the world. Glaciologists, paleogeneticists, forensic anthropologists. The remains were airlifted out one by one, kept frozen in temperature-controlled transport units and taken to high-security labs. And with every layer of ice they peeled away, the mystery only deepened. The preservation was so pristine that scientists could see the poor textures on their skin, the stitching on their clothing, the blood still trapped in muscle tissue. One of the adult males had a healed break in his arm, evidence of survival after trauma. Another had the blackened toes of frostbite, but no signs of rot. Meaning, he had survived the cold at least. For a time, perhaps most intriguing, a tiny bundle found clutched in the arms of a female, presumed to be the group's matriarch. Inside that bundle was something astonishing. Dried herbs, dozens of them, carefully wrapped in moss and birch bark. Some used for pain relief, others for fever. A few, still unidentified. This wasn't just survival. This was culture, knowledge, medicine. So again we ask, who were they? And more hauntingly, what were they running from? The terrain where they were found is not a place humans tend to wander. Even today, getting up there requires specialized gear, oxygen assistance, and satellite-guided paths. The cliffs are sheer, the crevasses invisible until it's too late. And yet, 10,000 years ago, without maps, ropes, or weather forecasts, an entire group of people made their way up here. Families, children, elders, carrying everything they owned on their backs. Why? Some scientists believe they were fleeing. From what we don't know, there's no evidence of another group nearby. No signs of war, no arrowheads embedded in the bodies. But their faces, frozen mid-expression, suggest a final moment that was anything but peaceful. Were they escaping a natural disaster? A volcanic eruption? Perhaps a famine, or something more intimate, exile from a larger tribe, a split over leadership, a forbidden belief. No one knows. Not yet. But we do know this. They climbed to their deaths, and yet not immediately, because the site wasn't just a deathbed, it was also a home. Evidence of fire pits, animal bones stripped of meat, stone tools arranged by function, even the charred remnants of what may have been a fur-lined tent. This wasn't a failed journey. This was a last stand. Let's pause here. Imagine the scene. A dwindling group, out of options, surrounded by snow and silence. They light fires each night and huddle for warmth. They grind bones into marrow, boiled roots into soup. Maybe they tell stories of the warm forests below, of the ancestors who walked with animals, of gods who watch from behind the stars. And every day, the ice creeps closer, until one night, the fires go out, one by one, and then silence. For 10,000 years. Until now. As the excavation continued, one object stood out more than any other. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a tool. It was a carving. Small, made from antler smoothed by years of handling. It depicted a creature, half-beast with long antlers and a wide, staring face, eyes shaped like suns. Some said it resembled other prehistoric depictions of shamans or forest spirits. Others saw something more unsettling, a warning, perhaps, a memory of something they left behind. Why would they carry this figure to the mountaintop? Was it protection, or a curse? As Chapter 1 closes, one thing is clear. This isn't just another archaeological discovery. This is the kind of mystery that bends history. Because for a tribe to end up frozen on top of the world, in numbers, with evidence of community, ritual, and resistance, something extraordinary must have happened. And in the chapters to come, we'll pull back the layers. We'll examine their world, their migration, the possible threats that pushed them upward, and most hauntingly, the clues that tell us how they died. But fair warning, the deeper we go, the colder it gets. Are you ready to keep going? The Alps, majestic, brutal, ancient. To us, they're a marvel of nature. Snow-capped peaks rising like white fangs into the clouds, a place for skiing, hiking, and postcard-worthy views. But to early humans, the Alps were something else entirely. They were a wall, a boundary between life and death, between the known world of forests, rivers, game trails, and the unknown, where gods might sleep, where spirits might roam, and where no one was meant to go. And yet the lost tribe went there. Why? To understand that, we need to look not just at what they were escaping, but where they ended up, and what kind of place receives the final breath of an entire community. First, let's talk about the terrain. The tribe was found at nearly 3,000 meters above sea level, on a desolate ridge, exposed to fierce winds and deadly cold. Glaciers move slowly here, carving through stone over centuries, like a blade through clay. Avalanches are frequent. Temperatures plunge below -20°C, even in summer. In short, this is not a place you stumble into. Even modern climbers, decked out in high-tech gear, avoid this region during certain months. So how, and more importantly why, would a prehistoric tribe have made the treacherous climb barefoot, wrapped in hides, burdened with children and belongings? It wasn't just a random ascent. It was a choice, or perhaps a last resort. Geological studies of the site offer clues. The ridge on which they were found is not just a frozen wasteland. It was once a pass, a narrow corridor between two valleys. Thousands of years ago, as the climate was warming after the Ice Age, this area would have opened briefly during summer months, revealing a short-lived but critical migration route, a shortcut, a narrow escape. It's possible the tribe used this pass as a desperate route over the mountains, perhaps fleeing drought, encroaching enemies, or a broken homeland. But then, perhaps due to early snowfall or unexpected climate change, they became trapped. The door that opened for them slammed shut behind them. What began as a crossing turned into a tomb. And there's something else. GLACIOLOGISC examining the ice layers around the site discovered anomalies. Thin, dark bands within the ice sheet. These indicate ancient soot particles, smoke, essentially trapped in snow layers dating back 10,300 years. What does that tell us? There were fires burning up here, repeatedly, not just once. This wasn't a single-night survival camp. The tribe stayed for weeks, maybe months. Which raises the next question. How did they survive, even temporarily, in such a hostile place? The answer lies in the ice caves. About 400 meters from the main site, a secondary cluster of artifacts was discovered, deep inside a natural rock formation, partially hidden by snowdrift. Once mapped and examined, it became clear. This wasn't just a rock, it was a shelter. Inside, researchers found smoke-blackened stone, fragments of bone, and what appeared to be nesting areas made from stacked furs and dry moss. Even traces of fecal matter, human and animal, confirmed habitation. Here's the incredible part. Isotope analysis of the bone fragments revealed ibex, marmot, and possibly even snow hare, species that roam alpine zones. This tribe was hunting at high altitude. And not just scavenging. They had fashioned traps, snares, and stone arrowheads designed specifically for small, fast-moving prey. In other words, they were adapting, improvising, fighting to stay alive, not tourists in a storm. But there's something eerie about how well they adapted, and how quickly they were undone. You'd think that a group capable of surviving above the tree line could find a way down, or signal help, or simply wait for the pass to reopen. But the evidence suggests otherwise. There were no signs of movement beyond the shelter area. No trail markers. No migration attempt. Nothing to indicate that they even tried to leave after a certain point. It's as if they gave up, or something forced them to stay. And that's where the mystery deepens, because not far from the shelter, carved into the inner wall of the cave, was a series of symbols, not drawings. Not animals or hunt scenes, but abstract, geometric shapes, triangles, spirals, eyes. One symbol, repeated several times, looked strikingly like a jagged X, enclosed in a circle, a symbol never before catalogued in any European prehistoric art. What does it mean? We don't know, but it wasn't random. It was placed with intention, repeated, important enough to scratch into stone. Perhaps even during their final days. Could it be a warning, a prayer, a record, or something more supernatural? The mountain has always had a spiritual weight in human mythology. All across the world, high places are sacred. In Andes mythology, mountains are gods. In Norse belief, the highest peaks were the realm of the giants. In Siberian cultures, shamans climbed mountains to speak with the spirits of the sky. Could the lost tribe have believed something similar? Could they have climbed not just to escape, but to commune, to leave behind the world of men and reach the realm of the ancestors? Or perhaps to appease some force they thought they had angered? The antler-carved idol we mentioned in Chapter 1, the one with the sun-shaped eyes, was found placed near the cave entrance. Not buried, not hidden, placed, as if guarding it, as if watching. There's one more theory, not spiritual, but tragic. Some scientists now believe that what we're seeing may be the result of internal collapse. The tribe may have made it up the mountain in hopes of a better life, but once there, tensions rose, supplies dwindled, leadership faltered, and a kind of psychological cold set in, deeper and deadlier than the physical one outside. Isolation, starvation, fear. It can twist even the strongest community into something unrecognizable. We know, from later historical accounts, such as the infamous Donner Party in 1846, that when humans are pushed to the brink in remote conditions, things can go very, very wrong. But we also know that humans are capable of astonishing resilience. So, we're left with two opposing images. One, a tribe destroyed by its own descent into chaos. The other, a tribe united until the very end, trying desperately to preserve dignity, tradition, and hope. Which one is true? The evidence is still buried in the ice. Before we close this chapter, consider this. Most archaeological discoveries are buried underground, crushed under time and earth. But the lost tribe, they were preserved, suspended, untouched, as if the mountain itself was keeping a secret, as if it wanted someone, someday, to find them, to tell their story, to ask the questions they never got to answer. And so we keep digging, not just for bones and tools, but for the humanity frozen beneath the snow. Their breath may be gone, but their whispers still echo in the silence of the peaks. Names carry power. They shape how we remember, how we understand, how we assign meaning to those who came before us. Think of the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, the Clovis people. We know them by location, by discovery, by fragments of cultural identity, pieced together through painstaking research. But this tribe, they had no name, no known language, no shared myth passed down through generations, no written words scratched into bark or stone. Until now, they were entirely absent from the human story. And yet here they are, frozen in time, perfectly preserved, whispering their existence across 10 millennia. So who were they? And how do we tell the story of a people who left behind no written history, no spoken tales, only the silent testimony of their bones? Let's begin with the basics, the biological clues. Forensic anthropologists started with the bodies. There were 12 individuals in total, 7 adults, 3 adolescents, and 2 children, 1 infant, perhaps less than a year old. The gender split was near even, and the adults ranged in age from late 20s to what appeared to be mid-60s, unusually old. For that time, that already tells us something. This wasn't a scouting party. This wasn't a raiding group. This was a multi-generational unit, the core of a living, breathing tribe, families, elders, children, likely a community in transit, bringing their world with them. Genetic testing confirmed a shared ancestry across many of the individuals. Several were related by blood parents, siblings, cousins, others, perhaps bonded by marriage or adoption. This was a kin group, a tribe in the true sense, not just a gathering of people, but an interwoven social fabric. They weren't wanderers. They were a society, and that opens the door to deeper questions. What were their beliefs, their customs, their identity? Clues came not from the bodies themselves, but from what they carried. Each person was found with a small pouch, worn around the neck or tied to the waist. Inside these were a mix of items: sharpened stones, beads made of bone and shell, dried roots, and bits of ochre pigment. But the most curious find: a set of flat, polished stones, thin and smooth, clearly shaped by human hands, each one marked with shallow etchings. Some scholars initially dismissed them as decoration, but others saw something more structured. Could this be proto-writing, a symbolic language? Perhaps a system of memory, a way to record stories, seasons, or lineage? If true, these etchings may represent one of the oldest known systems of communication among early humans in Europe, and that changes everything. Because it means this tribe may not have been isolated at all. They might have been part of a broader cultural web, one we've barely begun to uncover now. Here's where things get fascinating. Mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed from mother to child, revealed something startling. The tribe's genetic markers did not match the dominant lineages typically found in other post-Ice Age European populations. In fact, their genome showed greater similarity to populations further east, closer to the steppe regions of Central Asia. What does that mean? It suggests that these people, or at least their ancestors, had migrated westward, possibly across vast distances. Long before they reached the Alps, they weren't indigenous to the area where they were found. They were travelers, perhaps even pioneers, part of an early wave of human migration that left almost no trace, a missing link in the long, winding chain of human settlement. In other words, they didn't vanish. They were never properly seen to begin with. Further evidence emerged from their tools. The stone blades found with the tribe were unlike those used in nearby prehistoric communities. They bore a distinctive chisel-like edge, perfectly suited for both cutting and carving, possibly even for woodworking. This detail might seem minor, but to archaeologists it's gold. Because tool types act like fingerprints. They help trace movement, cultural exchange, and origin points. And these tools, they resembled specimens found thousands of kilometers away in the foothills of the Altai Mountains. Could this tribe's ancestors have come from that distant region? If so, their journey may have taken generations through forests, across rivers, over plains and mountains. A slow spread, a drifting of families, and eventually, a break from the larger group. A splinter tribe, one that forged its own path, until it hit the ice. So now we have a theory. This unnamed tribe, perhaps descended from early Central Eurasian migrants, was on the move, pushed westward by climate, conflict, or curiosity. Along the way, they developed their own customs, carried symbols, passed down medicine, and traveled in tight familial units. And for a time, they may have flourished. But then something changed, and everything collapsed. Here's where we shift. From genetics to cultural evidence, several of the older adults were buried with objects that appear ceremonial. A carved tooth, drilled and worn as a pendant. A wooden stick with notches, possibly a tally. And that now famous antler carving with the sun eyes and beast face. These were not mere trinkets. These were symbols of power. Some researchers believe they belonged to spiritual leaders, early shamans, or medicine elders, people tasked with preserving wisdom, guiding decisions, performing rites. Their presence within the group is meaningful, because it suggests that even at the edge of survival, even as the cold closed in, the tribe held onto ritual. They didn't descend into chaos. They remembered who they were. They carried meaning into the mountains with them. But what that meaning was remains a mystery. Without language, without oral history, we're left with fragments. Still, let's not underestimate those fragments, because they speak volumes. If we learn how to listen, take the clothing, for instance. Every member of the tribe wore layered garments made of stitched animal hides, deer ibex, and something else, possibly bear. The clothing was tailored, surprisingly well fitted, and in many cases adorned with tiny decorations, beads, feathers, small shell fragments. Not functional, purely aesthetic. Why dress with beauty when death is near? Because identity matters. Even in despair, perhaps especially in despair. Maybe those adornments were reminders of who they were, symbols of clan, of family, of home. Maybe they were worn for the dead, or the gods, or simply to feel human in the face of extinction. It's a small thing, but it echoes loudly across time. So now, picture them again, not as nameless bodies frozen in a glacier, but as people, with mothers and children, with memories and myths, with songs we'll never hear and names we'll never pronounce. They had rituals, they had roles, they had reasons, and they had each other, which makes their silence, their erasure from history, all the more haunting. Because how many other tribes like this existed, thrived, vanished, and were never found? How many human stories were wiped clean by time and ice? Some researchers have proposed naming them. After all, it's easier to study something with a name. But others argue that naming them would impose an identity they never chose. So for now, they remain the lost tribe of the ice. A placeholder. A question. Marked out an invitation to look deeper. Because maybe their name isn't meant to be found in a word, but in a legacy, in the DNA they passed forward, in the tools they left behind, in the symbols scratched into rock, in the way their story reshapes our understanding of what it means to be human. And that story is only just beginning. Before we dive deeper into the ice, we need to look behind it, because the story of the lost tribe didn't begin on that frozen ridge. Their journey started long before they ever climbed a mountain or faced a storm. To understand their final days, we have to rewind time, not just by years or decades, but by centuries. Maybe more. So let's go back. Step by step. Imagine a world slowly waking from an ancient slumber, the tail end of the last ice age. The glaciers were retreating. Slowly, grudgingly, like great sleeping beasts stirring after a long freeze. What had been miles of ice began to melt, giving way to rivers, meadows, and forests. Lakes formed where valleys had once been carved by ice. And with this transformation came something vital. Change. Big, terrifying, unstoppable change. For the people living through it, it must have felt like the ground itself was shifting beneath their feet. Because it was. Around 10,000 years ago, roughly the time we believe the lost tribe existed, the planet was entering what scientists called the Holocene epoch. It marked the end of the Pleistocene and the beginning of a more stable, warmer climate. But stable is a relative term. To our ancestors, it meant chaos. Their familiar world, one of mammoths, saber-toothed cats, endless tundras, was disappearing. And fast. Megafauna were dying off. Forests were replacing grasslands. The animals people had relied on for thousands of years were either gone or migrating elsewhere. Seasons shifted. Rains came at the wrong time, or not at all. Food grew scarcer. Territories shrank. And tribes started to collide. Can you feel it? That pressure. That mounting sense of urgency. Something had to give. Now, archaeologists studying this period have a phrase for what happened next: the Great Repositioning. It wasn't a war. Not exactly. It was more like a slow, desperate game of musical chairs, where the resources kept moving. But the people couldn't stop playing. Tribes across Europe and Asia were on the move, following game, escaping drought, seeking better land. Sometimes, they settled near rivers. Other times, they climbed hills, hoping the higher ground meant better weather or fewer threats. This period, quiet in the fossil record, was likely filled with tension. Imagine it. You've hunted in the same forest for generations. But now, the deer are gone. The trees have changed, and strangers begin to appear. Newcomers who speak a different tongue, wear different hides, carry unfamiliar weapons. Do you trade? Do you fight? Or do you leave? Over and over, early humans were faced with this choice. And somewhere in that shifting landscape, a small tribe, our lost tribe, made theirs. They chose to move. But what pushed them out? Here's where we dip into speculation. Guided by evidence, sediment core, pulled from lakes near the Alps, show a sharp decrease in plant diversity around 10,300 years ago. That likely means a period of ecological stress, fewer resources, crop failures, if they had begun early cultivation, or a collapse in local game populations. Add to that the discovery of ash layers in the same region, remnants of ancient wildfires likely sparked by a warming, drying climate, and it paints a grim picture. The world was becoming unstable, not just for one tribe, but for everyone. If the lost tribe lived in one of these affected valleys, they may have watched their home turn from fertile to fatal within a generation. It wouldn't take much. a few failed hunting seasons, a bitter winter, a dried up stream, and suddenly survival means leaving everything behind. Still, not every tribe fled to the mountains. So why did they? To understand that, we looked at patterns of migration. Many early humans followed a predictable path: downhill, downstream. Water meant food. Valleys meant warmth. So climbing up into the cold, into the unknown, was unnatural. Which means they weren't just migrating. They were escaping. But from what? One theory: conflict. As land grew scarce and tribes collided, tensions could have turned deadly. There's evidence in other prehistoric burial sites of spear wounds, skull fractures, and mass graves, signs of early warfare. But the lost tribe left no sign of battle behind them. No one followed. No one finished them off. No one buried them. It's as if they vanished like ghosts. But maybe they weren't fleeing violence. Maybe they were fleeing disease. Now, this part gets murky. We don't have clear records of pandemics from this era, but we do know humans lived closely with animals. They shared caves, tents, meat, blood. And when populations began settling in tighter groups, disease could spread quickly. A deadly fever, a strange wasting illness. Even if we never find direct evidence, it's possible such a plague hit their home. So they climbed higher, away from others, away from what they couldn't explain. A kind of ancient quarantine. But if that's true, the irony is heartbreaking. Because what they thought might save them only sealed their fate. There's another theory too. Not one of fear, but of faith. What if the mountains weren't just a refuge, but a destination? Across nearly every ancient culture, mountains were sacred. To the Greeks, Mount Olympus housed the gods. To early Andean cultures, high peaks were home to mountain spirits. Even in Siberian shamanism, the highest mountains were places of vision, prophecy, and ritual death. What if the lost tribe believed the mountain was holy? Not an escape, a pilgrimage. Something to do in times of crisis. A place to reconnect with ancestors. A last chance to speak with gods. It's possible they didn't die trying to survive. They died trying to understand. Or trying to be understood. But even if we don't know exactly why they left, we can reconstruct what they left behind. And that's just as telling. In valleys south of the ice site, archaeologists have discovered primitive dwellings that date back to the same window of time. Post-glacial, but these structures were made of saplings, bark, and bone clustered near rivers, surrounded by fire pits and tool caches. In one such site, just 90 kilometers from the glacier, remains of hearths, child burials, and ochre-painted stones were found. It's possible this was one of the tribe's earlier encampments, or perhaps a sister community. Either way, they had the beginnings of settlement, not just tents and fires, but roots. They lived in rhythm with the land. They fished, hunted, gathered berries, made basic tools, and most importantly, they passed down knowledge. Because when we look at what they carried into the mountains, medicines, symbols, tokens of memory, we see echoes of a larger world. A world they once belonged to, and then had to leave behind. It's a haunting image, isn't it? A people forced from their valley, carrying what they could, leaving behind familiar songs, burial grounds, perhaps even sacred trees. Looking back one last time before stepping into the cold. And what does that remind us of? Today, we see migrations on the news, families crossing deserts, oceans, fences, driven by war, drought, fear, seeking safety, dignity, hope. In many ways, the lost tribe's journey mirrors our own, because migration isn't just a prehistoric concept, it's human. We move, we adapt, we leave, we search, and sometimes we get lost, but not forgotten, because now, thousands of years later, science has finally caught up with the silence. We can read ice cores like books, decode bone chemistry like ancient letters, use genetics as a map through time, and in doing so, we begin to understand. The tribe didn't vanish because they were weak. They vanished because the world changed faster than they could. They were caught between eras, between the old ways and the new dangers. And their response, whether it was faith or fear or sheer instinct, led them upward and inward. To the last great silence. To the snow. And yet, they didn't go quietly. They left clues in their tools, in their rituals, in the very DNA that still echoes through some of us today. They left enough for us to find them, to mourn them, to remember them. And in the next chapter, we'll follow that final climb, the last brutal trek into the heart of the mountains. Step by step, we'll trace their footprints, and maybe, just maybe, we'll understand what it's like to walk willingly into the freeze. Close your eyes for a moment and picture this. A long, winding line of people, cloaked in furs and bound in woven hide, winding up a narrow pass between snow-dusted peaks. The wind screams through the stones like a ghost, and every breath steams in the brittle air. Below them, the valleys are lost in shadow. Ahead of them, a sky that never warms. This was not a trail meant for feet. It was a place made for birds and clouds and stars. But they climbed anyway. And this chapter is about that climb. The last journey of a tribe with no name. A march not into war, not into exile, but into something far colder and far more final. Archaeologists have retraced much of the route, at least. What they believe was the tribe's path. From lowland valleys rich in water and deer, they ascended into what we now know as the high alpine corridor. Along the way, clues remained almost like breadcrumbs, scattered across the centuries. Here's what they found. Stone tool fragments, embedded in cliffside ledges, flint flakes, shaped by hand, designed for cutting rope, skinning hides, trimming sinew, charred bone, likely from small game marmots, birds, rodents, burned in makeshift fire pits, beneath rock outcroppings, scattered, footprints fossilized in ancient mud, now mineralized by time and weather. Each of these tells a story. They didn't rush, they paused, made camp, slept, ate, waited for storms to pass. This wasn't a frantic escape, it was a measured ascent, paced and deliberate, which makes what comes next even more tragic. The higher they climbed, the more treacherous the terrain became. Narrow, ledges, exposed rock, no tree cover, no firewood. The wind grew sharper. Breathing became harder. Even a simple cut could freeze over before it bled. At altitudes above 2,500 meters. Even modern hikers suffer symptoms of altitude sickness, headaches, fatigue, nausea. For people without modern gear or oxygen support, these effects would have hit fast, especially for the children and elders. And yet, they kept going. Why? Here's a haunting possibility. Maybe they had no choice. By the time the lost tribe reached what we believe to be their final encampment, the ice cave and nearby ridge where their bodies were found, they had passed the point of no return. Snow blocked the trail behind them. Avalanches had collapsed the path. Food was gone. The air thinned. The tribe was sealed in, and the silence overwhelming. One researcher described the ridge like this. It feels like the edge of the world. You stand there, and the only sound is your own heartbeat. Imagine being there. Imagine knowing that going forward means death. But turning back isn't an option either, and still they tried to survive. This is where evidence becomes more intimate. They built windbreaks from stones, stacked hides into crude shelters, dug small depressions to trap heat, kept fires burning with whatever they could find, bones, dried moss, their own belongings. Even in the face of certain death they resisted. We found chewed bark, maybe birch or willow, known to dull pain and hunger. We found scratched marks on the rock near the fire pit, a crude calendar, perhaps, or simply a way to count the days. And we found something else, a burial, one of the children wrapped tightly in a hide, laid between two stones, and covered in snow. Not abandoned, not tossed aside, buried. With care. Even when the end was near, they held on to their humanity. But things changed. We see it in the final days. The last fires were smaller. The last bones, broken, marrow sucked dry. Tools were repurposed. A spade made into a scraper. A digging stick sharpened into a blade. Signs of desperation. Some of the bodies showed healed wounds, signs of hardship endured. But others showed fresh trauma, cracked ribs, fractured wrists. One adult had a deep gash to the thigh, possibly fatal, possibly not. Was it an accident? Or something darker? Here, we enter dangerous territory. Speculation. There is no clear evidence of violence within the tribe. No mass graves. No weapons embedded in bone. But the final positions of some of the bodies suggest disorder. One man was found curled away from the others alone, half buried in drifted snow. Another, a young woman, was found clutching a stone, her body rigid, as if in defense. Were there disagreements? Fights? Did hunger erode trust? Or were they simply scattered by the storm, caught by surprise? We may never know. But survival strips people down, and when the world narrows to fire, food, and fear, anything is possible, even among those we love. Still, the most remarkable part of this story isn't how they died. It's how long they resisted death. Because even at the bitter end, they held onto life. They huddled together, shared warmth, shared stories, perhaps whispered to the children, clutched symbols of meaning, beads, carvings, feathers. One of the final remains discovered, a male in his 30s, had placed under his head a flat, smooth stone, polished, unmarked, maybe a pillow, maybe a token. Either way, it wasn't practical, it was emotional that matters, because it tells us something crucial. They weren't just surviving. They were feeling, reflecting, grieving, dying as humans. So what finally took them? The cold. Yes, but also the altitude, the hunger, the isolation, perhaps infection, perhaps despair. But more than that time, the world turned. The snows rose. The firewood ran out, and one by one the lights went out, until there was only silence and ice. When we look at the ridge today, all we see is snow. But beneath that snow lies a frozen chapter of human history, a record of love, struggle, courage, and quiet surrender. Because they didn't die fighting. They didn't die running. They died climbing, choosing motion over stillness, hope over fear. Even when that hope led nowhere, there's something beautiful in that, something achingly human. And perhaps, in the end, that's what they leave us. Not answers, but understanding of what it means to hold on to dignity in the face of extinction. To carry your stories uphill, even when no one may hear them. To leave behind traces, not for fame or memory, but simply because you existed. In the next chapter, we'll shift from the trek to the survival attempt. Inside the ice cave, we find a haunting record of their final days, what they ate, what they burned, how they prayed, and how they faced the long, inevitable dark. It's not just about dying in the cold. It's about living in it, day after day, and the choices no human should ever have to make. Imagine stepping into a cave carved from frozen time, no sound, no breeze, just the thick stillness of ice all around you, walls that shimmer like glass, ceilings draped in hoarfrost, and air so cold it burns your lungs. Now imagine living in it, not for hours, not even for days, but for weeks. This is where the trail of the vanished tribe ends and where one of the most haunting chapters in prehistoric history begins. The discovery of the ice cave shook the archaeological world. It was found high in the Alps, hidden beneath a glacial overhang, protected by centuries of snowfall. Inside, researchers found what can only be described as a time capsule. Frozen remains of people, tools, food scraps, animal bones, even smoke stains on the icy ceiling. This wasn't just a shelter. It was a last stand, a desperate experiment in surviving the unsurvivable. Let's talk about the layout first. The cave itself was shallow but wide, with a narrow entrance just large enough to crawl through. Inside, it opened into a basin-like space, maybe 6 or 7 meters across. The floor was uneven, icy in places, sloped in others. The roof jagged, but insulated, but it wasn't comfortable. But it was better than the wind. Stone tools found scattered along the perimeter suggest it was used for multiple purposes: sleeping, eating, crafting, and most chillingly burying. Yes, even in the cave, there were graves. Not formal ones, no carved markers or tombs, but shallow scoops in the snow, where the bodies of children were tucked, wrapped in hide, covered in packed snow. Out of sight, out of mind, or out of love. Let's rewind and picture that first night. The tribe had just finished their brutal climb. Food was scarce. The youngest were already fading. Their clothes were soaked with melted snow and sweat. The firewood, barely enough for a single night. But in the darkness of the cave, they found silence. And silence can feel like safety. They unpacked what little they had: dried meat, tools, ornaments, bits of bone and bark. Someone kindled a fire near the mouth of the cave. Another laid out hide mats. The children were wrapped tightly and tucked in the warmest corner. It wasn't home, but it had walls. And in that moment, walls were everything. Over the next few days, the cave transformed. They tried to make it livable, gathering twigs from nearby shrubs, collecting snowmelt for water, setting up a kind of rotation around the fire to keep it burning without wasting fuel. Bones of small animals were cracked open for marrow. Stomach contents of one of the deceased later revealed boiled moss, lichen, and tree bark, all signs of extreme starvation. But they weren't giving up. Not yet. They crafted new tools from broken pieces, sharpened bone into needles, fashioned makeshift snowshoes from twisted sinew and bent branches, likely in hopes of sending hunters out to forage. One of the most poignant finds, a tiny pendant, carved from antler, shaped like a bird in flight. It wasn't practical. It wasn't edible. But someone made it anyway. Hope, perhaps, frozen in the shape of a feathered dream. But as the days stretched on, the cave grew darker. Literally and figuratively. The soot on the ceiling thickened. The air grew stale. The firewood gone. Soon they were burning anything. Broken tools, scraps of hide, even the handles of their own spears. One of the fires contained bits of human bone, burned to charcoal. Was it a burial ritual or something darker? This is the part that makes archaeologists hesitate. Not because they don't have theories, but because they do, and they're chilling. When survival reaches its edge, the line between custom and necessity blurs. In the remains found within the cave, at least 2 adult individuals showed post-mortem cuts, consistent with bone fragments bore heat cracks from fire. There were missing joints, disarticulated spines, and in one case, long bones that had been split open. There's no way to sugarcoat it. The tribe may have turned to cannibalism, not in cruelty, not in malice. But in the raw, terrible logic of survival. It's easy for us to judge, sitting in our warm homes, bellies full, heat on. But ask yourself, what would you do to keep your child alive? Would you refuse if it meant everyone else would die? It's a question that echoes through history. And in this cave, it might have had an answer, but the tribe didn't leave behind explanations. They left behind gestures. One skeleton, believed to be a mother, was found with her arms wrapped around the bodies of 2 children. Afinal, imbrasi. One arm had been fractured post-mortem, possibly while moving her body, yet her face was turned toward the entrance, as if she was still waiting, watching for rescue. Let's pause for a moment. It's tempting to make this all about death, about the horror, the suffering, the slow erosion of hope. But this isn't a horror story. It's a human story. Because in the middle of all this darkness, we still find symbols of light. That bird-shaped pendant, the shallow graves, a small red handprint, pressed against the icy cave wall, maybe a child's, maybe just a mark to say, I was here. Even as the cold closed in, they reached out to each other, to the future, to something beyond their icy prison. They didn't expect to be remembered, but they remembered each other, and that matters. So how did it end? Quietly, most likely. The fires burned out. The hunters stopped returning. The elders died in their sleep, or close to it. The youngest faded first. The strongest lasted longest. And then there was silence. Eventually, snow sealed the cave completely. The mountains swallowed them whole. It would be thousands of years before anyone opened that door again. Thousands of years before humans would descend into that same cave, flashlights in hand, eyes wide, hearts pounding. And there, in the silence, they'd find the truth, that life isn't always about triumph. Sometimes, it's about endurance. And sometimes just being remembered is enough. In our next chapter, we'll uncover how this frozen tragedy finally came to light. Who found the cave? How did scientists piece together the final hours? And what mysteries remain unsolved? Because even now, after decades of research, there are things in that ice no one can explain. Things that whisper from the past. Asking the one question we may never answer. Why did they go into the mountains in the first place? It began like any other expedition. A handful of climbers, ropes in hand, boots crunching over deep powder, and the wind slicing across the ridge like a whisper with teeth. They weren't archaeologists. They weren't looking for lost tribes or ancient secrets. They were just explorers. And then, they saw it, a depression in the snow that shouldn't have been there. A collapse, maybe. A small sinkhole, just wide enough for someone to fall through. And someone did. What they found beneath that fragile crust of snow wasn't a crevasse. It was a mouth to something ancient. The air that blew out was different, dry, still, and wrong. It carried the scent of earth and age. Not rot, not death, but something colder, more clinical. And inside that hole, just a few meters down, their headlamps caught a glint. Not metal, not rock. Ice. And behind that ice, a hand. The climbers scrambled back to their base camp and radioed the nearest alpine rescue service. At first, the authorities assumed it was a tragic mountaineer fatality. Maybe an old hiker, lost decades ago. His remains preserved by the permafrost. But when rescue crews returned and chipped further into the glacier, what they found made one thing immediately clear. This wasn't one body, it was dozens. And they weren't wearing nylon jackets or oxygen tanks. They were wrapped in fur and hide, and their tools were made of stone. This wasn't the site of a recent accident. It was a prehistoric tomb. News spread fast. The discovery sparked a flurry of international attention. Within days, researchers from universities across Europe descended on the site, eager to see what had emerged from the frozen cradle of time. Carbon dating quickly blew the doors off all expectations. The remains were over 8,000 years old. This wasn't just a remarkable discovery. It was a time machine. But the cave didn't give up its secrets easily. The entrance was narrow and dangerous. The ceiling was unstable. The inside was cold enough to sap the warmth from your bones in minutes. And then there were the bodies. Dozens of them, layered in positions that defied easy explanation. Some lying side by side, others curled in corners, a few stacked as if in haste or desperation. And among the bodies, tools, ornaments. Ornaments, bones, and the unmistakable traces of smoke on the ceiling. So, how did scientists begin to make sense of this? How do you interpret silence or frozen chaos? It started with mapping. Every item was logged, every body scanned and preserved in place. 3D imaging was used to reconstruct the exact layout of the cave when it was sealed by snow. The temperature, airflow, and ice patterns were analyzed to model how the cave had shifted over millennia. And then came the forensics. Bone analysis revealed a heartbreaking pattern: signs of malnutrition, cold stress, and inflammatory disease, teeth worn down from chewing bark and root fiber, joints showing signs of frostbite, arthritis, and in some cases violent trauma. Some skulls bore hairline fractures, others had teeth missing, not from decay but likely from blunt force. But there were no weapons in their wounds, no signs of invasion, no external enemies. The killer was the cold, and time, and maybe each other. One particular body drew immediate attention. A male, roughly in his 30s, found near the mouth of the cave. His posture was upright, slumped against the icy wall, arms wrapped around a small bundle of hide. Inside that bundle, the remains of a child, maybe 2 years old. In his other hand, a stone blade, dulled and worn to the hilt. Was he guarding the entrance? Was he the last one to die? Or the last one left? Then came the personal items. Necklaces carved from animal teeth, a fragment of painted bark, a polished black stone that didn't match the local geology likely carried hundreds of miles. And a bone flute. Still intact, still playable, when researchers carefully blew through it. Using specialized air tools to avoid contamination, it let out a single, soft, mournful note. A sound not heard in thousands of years. Can you imagine that? The echo of a prehistoric melody, trapped in silence for millennia, now floating out across a sterile laboratory. GOOSEBUMPS. As more layers were uncovered, so were more questions. Why were these people here? Why this high? Why this remote? And why had no one known about them until now? Here's where things got weird. Genetic testing of the remains revealed something surprising. These people weren't from the Alps. Their genetic profile matched populations hundreds of kilometers away, from regions far to the northeast. They were migrants, or refugees. So what drove them here? Climate change, drought, conflict. The leading theory, pieced together through isotope analysis of bones, pollen trapped in clothes, and even chemical traces in tooth enamel, points to a rapid environmental collapse, a famine, a migration triggered by necessity. They weren't exploring, they were fleeing, and the cave wasn't their goal. It was their end. But there's one part of the discovery that still confounds experts. In the very back of the cave, past the grave pit, past the hearth, past the storage area, they found a symbol, carved into the ice. Not scratched, not hacked, carved, with precision. A geometric pattern. Circles inside triangles, repeated in 3 places. No one knows what it means. Some say it was ritualistic, a way to mark the place as sacred. Others say it was a warning, but a few suggest something more chilling. That the tribe knew they were being watched, and this was their last message, a symbol to whoever found them. One researcher put it best: we didn't just find bones. We found the echoes of minds that once thought, feared, and hoped just like us. The site has since been sealed, not for secrecy, but for preservation. Too much warmth from human presence was beginning to thaw the ice, and as one glaciologist warned, if we unseal the cave completely, we risk destroying what it's kept safe for thousands of years. So the frozen tomb remains locked again. Except this time, we know it's there, and it's whispering. So here we are, deep in the belly of the mystery. A tribe, lost to time. A cave full of frozen bodies, preserved so well you can see the lines in their palms. A flute, still able to sing. A symbol, carved where no one was meant to look. But the bodies alone don't tell the full story. They give us data, age, cause of death, tools used, food eaten. But what about why? Why did they die there? Why did they go there at all? And what happened in those final, frozen days? This is where science meets something stranger. Theory, and in some cases folklore. Let's start with what most archaeologists agree on. The mainstream theory. The tribe, based on isotopic and genetic evidence, came from the northeast. Likely, driven out by a cascade of climate events. Droughts dried up their traditional hunting grounds. Animal herds shifted migration patterns. And then, to make matters worse, an early cold snap hit. Think about that. A perfect storm. No food. No warmth. And maybe, no welcome from neighboring groups. Desperation drove them higher into the mountains. Seeking shelter in a cave they either stumbled upon or remembered from ancestral memory. The fire pits, the layers of bedding, and the smoke-stained ceiling suggest they tried to hold out. For days, maybe weeks. But they were already weak when they arrived. And the mountain doesn't forgive. But here's where things get murky. That theory makes sense. Logically, chronologically, even emotionally. But it doesn't explain the geometric symbols, the odd placement of certain bodies, the fact that some individuals died in separate corners, far from the group, or the strange wear on certain bones, suggesting behaviors that don't match survival patterns. And that's why alternative theories started bubbling up, some more credible than others. Let's take a tour through the most compelling and the most chilling. One group of researchers believes the tribe wasn't running from something external but from within, that they were cast out, banished, possibly for spiritual or social reasons, disease, perceived bad luck, or even a crime. They point to the cave's remote location as evidence. If they were fleeing famine, why not settle in lower valleys? Why push this far up? The answer: they weren't allowed to settle anywhere else. This would explain why the burial felt hasty, but also strangely ritualized. Why bodies were curled, in specific positions, or grouped by age and sex. It paints a tragic picture, not just a group dying from exposure, but one dying from rejection. This one is darker. According to some anthropologists, the layout of the cave suggests a structured ritual, not a chaotic death spiral. Some bodies had ochre stains near their hands and feet. Others had small bones placed beside their heads, like offerings. And then there's that bone flute. What if this wasn't a desperate shelter? What if it was a sacred place of departure? A place where the tribe came to die willingly. Together sounds unthinkable, but maybe not. For a culture with different values around death, think of it as a prehistoric version of a mass ritual exit. An attempt to preserve the tribe's identity. Even in extinction. A kind of spiritual closure in the face of ecological collapse. Now, we wade into grim waters. Some bones showed strange cut marks, not made by animals, but by tools. Some long bones were split, possibly for marrow extraction. These patterns aren't widespread, but they're there. Does this mean they turned on each other? In small numbers, maybe. Desperation does terrible things to people, especially in isolated groups with no help coming. And if just one winter storm blocked their path down, they could have been snowed in for months. Even a few weeks without food could fracture the bonds of civility. What would you do if your child was starving? If your friend died beside you, still warm? If your tribe was fading into nothing? These are uncomfortable questions. But history and archaeology tells us they've been answered before. Others believe it wasn't hunger or cold that doomed them, but something smaller. A virus. An infection. Several of the bodies showed signs of systemic inflammation, swollen joints, fluid in lung cavities, darkened fingernails. It may have been pneumonia, or something worse, a viral hemorrhagic disease. The idea here is chilling. The tribe realized a sickness was spreading among them, and they went into the cave to isolate themselves, either to protect others or in hopelessness. Once inside, they couldn't return. They sealed their fate with the stone slabs, blocking the entrance. This theory would explain why the cave entrance was partially hidden, why tools were found piled near the mouth, almost as if abandoned mid-use. And it would also explain why some of the final burials looked rushed, bodies stacked rather than placed. A sudden collapse of order, a slow, suffocating end. Let's talk fringe, but not fantasy. Some believe that the symbols on the cave wall weren't made by the tribe themselves, that they were carved after death, or worse, before, by someone else. This theory suggests that the tribe may have encountered another group, one they didn't understand, one with different language, beliefs, and symbols. Conflict may have erupted. Or, what if the symbols weren't tribal marks at all? What if they were a warning, a sign from others, left to mark cursed ground? We'll never know. But if that symbol meant something profound, and no one alive remembers what, then, maybe, just maybe, it was never meant to be understood by us. And then, there are the legends. The ones whispered by the mountain people passed down over generations. Stories of the ice sleepers, of a people who walked into the snow and never came back, of strange lights near the glacier, and echoes in caves long after the winds died down. One tale, told by an old herder who grew up near the region, goes like this. There were once people who displeased the spirits. They forgot the old ways, and so the mountains opened to swallow them. Now, they sleep in the cold. And if you find them, don't disturb them. They're still listening. Superstition. Sure. But doesn't it strike you as odd how many ancient myths mirror archaeological truths? We once thought Troy was a fable. Then, someone found it. We laughed at flood myths until we found the Black Sea. Flood layer. Maybe there's truth hidden in the ice. 2. Just waiting for us to listen differently. Here's what we know for sure. The tribe wasn't primitive. They were skilled toolmakers, resourceful, and communal. They tried to survive. They left behind signs, symbols, and stories, etched in stone, shaped in bone, and frozen in time. They didn't vanish without a trace. They just waited long enough for us to notice. And maybe the greatest mystery isn't how they boat, how we keep forgetting they ever lived. Because this isn't just a story about the past, it's a mirror. What happens to us when the climate turns, when food grows scarce, when we have to choose between community and survival? Will we be remembered, or will we be found, one day frozen in silence, waiting to be understood? Step into the cave again. It's cold, still silent. But the silence isn't empty, it's full of questions, full of meaning, full of echoes, not just of this vanished tribe, but of us. Because what we uncover in places like this, buried deep in the earth, beneath ice and time, isn't just ancient history. It's a reflection, a reminder that we, the modern human, aren't as different as we like to believe. Strip away our phones, cities, and machines, and what are we? We're hungry, we're frightened, we love, we protect, we remember. Just like them. So in this chapter, let's stop asking what happened to them, and ask instead, what does their story reveal about us? Let's start with the obvious. They were a family. Maybe not in the nuclear sense, mother, father, 2 kids, and a dog. But they were bonded. The genetic mapping shows a web of kinship, uncles, nieces, siblings, cousins. One woman in her late 20s was found embracing 2 children. Her arms were still curled around their rib cages, even after 8,000 years. DNA confirms. She wasn't their mother, but she might have been their aunt. Or simply someone who loved them. And isn't that just so human? Love doesn't always follow bloodlines. Sometimes, it just follows need. Nearby, 2 older males were found seated beside each other, their backs against the cave wall. Knees drawn up, shoulders touching. They weren't biologically related, but their bones bore matching injuries, healed fractures, worn knees, old breaks, as if they had hunted, fought, and grown old together. A team, maybe even best friends. You can almost imagine their final moments. Talking quietly, watching the fire flicker as the cold crept in. There's no written record of who they were, but in their position, in the tilt of their skulls, in the fact that they died side by side, we can feel something familiar. They were artists. That carved bone flute, it wasn't utilitarian. It wasn't a hunting whistle or a signal tool. It was tuned, meaning, it played notes. Specific ones. Some archaeologists tried replicating it. When played, it produces a pentatonic scale. The same basic scale used in lullabies and folk songs around the world. Even today, think about that. A lullaby, in a cave, in a dying world. Someone wanted music. Someone needed it, not to survive, but to feel. And that's not primitive, that's human. The symbols carved near the ceiling, spirals, zigzags, concentric circles, are echoed in cultures across continents and centuries. Some see them as maps. Others say they're meant to induce trance. Still others believe they're messages, passed down across generations in ways we no longer understand. But the takeaway is this. They wanted to communicate something that words couldn't hold. They wanted meaning to last. They wanted to leave behind more than bones. Now, let's talk about fear, because it's all over the cave. In the way some of the dead were buried hurriedly, unevenly. In the way some bodies were placed facing away from others, as if trying to retreat. In the traces of soot, layered thickly in one corner, suggesting desperate attempts to keep the fire alive, long after the wood was gone. There's fear in the way they clung together, in the fact that no one tried to flee, even when death was clearly coming. Why? Because the alternative, being alone out there in the snow, was worse. Because when everything crumbled, they chose each other, even in fear, even in death. And what about belief? They had it. That much is clear. Why else arrange the bodies so carefully? Why else place small stones in the mouths of the dead? A practice seen in later cultures as a symbolic gesture to prepare someone for the afterlife. Why else leave behind the tools they could have used to dig, to escape, to fight? Because maybe they thought they were going somewhere, someplace beyond this frozen tomb. Maybe they thought they would meet again. We do this, too. We bury our dead. With keepsakes, we hold funerals. We carve names into stone and whisper to the air, hoping someone, somewhere, hears us. Isn't it humbling? To know that even before language, before agriculture, before gods had names, people still felt the need to say goodbye? Now, let's zoom out, because here's where it gets even more relevant to our world. This tribe was pushed into the mountains by climate change. Not modern, man-made climate change, but a natural shift, a cold period, a disruption in rain patterns. The world they knew stopped working. The animals moved. The plants withered, and suddenly, everything they had known for generations was gone. Sound familiar? We're living through something eerily similar. Only this time, it's happening faster, and on a scale the tribe could never have imagined. But the reaction is the same. Migration, fear, competition, collapse. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And yet, here's the hopeful part. They adapted, they traveled, they innovated, they made art, played music, protected their young. Right up until the very end. They tried. They didn't give up. And that's something we need to remember. Because if they could hold on to their humanity in the middle of an extinction-level event, so can we. It's easy to look at ancient people and see only what's missing. No writing, no cities, no civilization. But what if we've been asking the wrong question? What if the real question is, what did they have that we've forgotten? They listened to the land. They knew their place in the ecosystem, not as conquerors, but as participants. They raised children not in isolated homes, but in shared shelters. They accepted death not as a failure of medicine, but as a part of life. And in the darkest hour, they reached for music, not weapons. Tell me that's not worth remembering. So, what does this tribe tell us about ourselves? Everything. That love is older than language, that art is older than agriculture, that fear and hope live side by side, even in caves, that humans have always searched for meaning, even when all seems lost, and that no matter how much time passes, still belong to each other. The last torch flickers out, the boots crunch back across the snow, and finally, the heavy frost-covered door is sealed shut again. The cave, silent for 8,000 years, is once more left to the dark. But this time, it's different. This time, we know it's there, and the question now lingers like breath in the cold. What do we do with a memory like this? There's a moment in every discovery, right after the AW, before the frenzy, when we're forced to make a decision, and it's never simple. Do we keep digging? Do we tell the world, or do we leave it alone? That's the dilemma archaeologists and ethicists now face with the Ice Cave tribe, because opening the cave wasn't just a scientific breakthrough, it was an ethical awakening. This wasn't just a pile of bones, that it was a tomb, a home, a sacred space. And we walked right in, disturbing the dead. It's a phrase tossed around easily in documentaries and museum tours. But for many indigenous communities and cultural heritage experts, it means something very real. It means desecration. It means trauma. It means taking from the past without permission. So now, there's growing pressure on the global scientific community to ask, was it right to enter? And should we ever return? The original research team, to their credit, knew this conversation was coming. They made high-resolution 3D scans of every inch of the chamber. They used ground-penetrating radar and non-invasive spectrometry tools wherever possible. They took DNA samples from one tooth per individual. No more, and then they stopped. They left most of the site untouched. Deliberately, because sometimes, the most respectful thing you can do is not look. Still, the debate continues. Some say the cave should be declared permanently off, that it should remain sealed, a time capsule for future generations, or perhaps for no one at all. Others argue that with better technology, we could learn more. There may be pollen particles in the dust, dormant bacteria in the ice, even clothing, fibers still clinging to the cave wall, so why leave knowledge behind? But here's the deeper question. What is the purpose of discovery? Is it to satisfy curiosity? To publish papers? To rewrite textbooks? Or is it to remember? To carry forward what we learn, not just as facts, but as values? Because what this cave gave us wasn't just data. It was perspective. It reminded us that human stories don't begin with us. They stretch backward, long before empires, religions, or written words, and they will continue long after we're gone. Already, the cave has sparked policy changes in several Arctic nations. New laws now require independent ethics panels for all glacial or permafrost excavations, not just scientific review boards. Some indigenous groups have requested formal involvement in archaeological oversight, particularly when the remains might be ancestral. Museums, too, are feeling the ripple. There's a growing movement to digitize but not display ancient human remains, especially those found in burial contexts like this one. The goal: preserve knowledge, respect humanity. Two things that, for too long, were treated as opposites. Back in the cave, the silence holds steady and deep inside. The tribe remains as they were, curled together beneath the stone, suspended in time. Not as curiosities, not as objects, but as people. People who laughed, struggled, sang, grieved, and died, just like us. They don't need our pity, but they deserve our care. So what should happen now? Here's what is happening. The site has been reclassified as a protected cultural sanctuary. No further digging will take place without full global consensus. A virtual replica of the cave has been created, available in educational labs, museums, and universities around the world. In it, you can walk the icy chamber, hear simulated wind, stand beside the hearth, view the carvings on the walls. It's haunting. It's beautiful. It's quiet. It's a bridge from their world to ours. And perhaps that's the best way forward. Let the real place rest. Let the memory move. Let us carry what we've seen not in our hands, but in our hearts. Because here's the truth. The tribe didn't vanish, not really. They're in our lullabies, in our campfires, in our instincts to protect one another, to seek shelter, to pass stories down. They're in the way we grieve and the way we love. We are not just the descendants of kings and conquerors. We are also the children of them, of quiet people in cold caves who held each other close when the world collapsed. So next time you see frost on your window or hear the wind howling outside, gather with people you love around a fire. Pause, listen, and maybe, just maybe, you'll hear them. Not in words, but in echoes.